Thank you very much for this most kind introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here. Especially now, I have to promote my new book, A Study of the Eastern Sword, which was just released this August. The title, I have to admit, is a little bit vague and general, and the reason is that this is our attempt to present a general 360 pages of very large format introduction to the subject of Eastern sabers. And by Eastern sabers, we actually originally started with the Ottoman and Persian work, and then we realized we can't write anything about it without writing about the Mamluks. And we can't write anything about the Mamluks without writing about the nomadic cultures, the Mongol period swords, the Cuman, the Khazar period swords. And if we start writing about those, well, we have to start writing about the beginning, which is the East Asian civilization. And even if we start writing about those, we have to say a couple of words about Scythians, who influenced these regions tremendously. So that's kind of involved in a very long and very involved discussion of various subjects, all of which concentrate around the evolution that was experienced by a single-edged long sword called saber in the past 2,000 years, from East Asia to the nomadic civilizations of Central Asia and Eastern Europe, and then to the Middle East, to the Persians, the Ottomans, and most importantly, in our thinking, the Mamluks. So thank you very much for your attention. In the next couple of hours, we'll try to give a very short version of this material. Now, a big question is why such general approach is actually possible at all. And there are a few arguments that suggest that it is the right way to approach the problem. And first and foremost, because by far most technological advances in history have single source origin. They're not going to be reinvented somewhere else. Instead, they're going to propagate from their origin, and during this propagation, they will acquire some regional characteristics, but it will take some time. So a characteristic time parameter over which this propagation changes into evolution is hundreds of years. And even after there's some evolution locally, and we have essentially a new sword form, it's still going to bear some marks of the original design. So even if, though there are some gaps in our data, gaps in existing weapons, we can interpolate over them, taking in mind that this process takes hundreds of years. Fortunately, there is also a lot of archaeological data available, especially from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which is a treasure trove of archaeology. And this data mitigates a lot of issues we have with not having enough data, essentially. So why it was not done until now? And I really like to emphasize that our generation lives in a time of unprecedented possibilities when it comes to studying material culture. First and foremost, digital photography completely changes everything we know about the subject. Because 30 years ago, the first-class professional would have to keep in memory all these hundreds of objects that one needs to reference on a constant basis to form an opinion. And there was not even any reasonable possibility to write any kind of generic treatment or general treatment of the subject by utilizing collections from many museums. Photographing items in storage rooms was extraordinarily difficult. Today, it's done quickly, it's done digitally. The images are emailed to you or you get just a link. So it's very easy comparatively. You actually have to deal more with lawyers than with photographers to do this kind of research and to do this kind of publications, something we were not able to do, again, even 13 years ago. Now, this comes with a certain responsibility. And here I have to reference that there was work done by Professor Decorative, who attempted to write general books about interactions between East Asia and Mongols specifically, and the Pontic-Caspian steppe and the Middle East. And I know Middle Eastern weaponry and Caucasian weaponry, I would say, relatively well. At least I like to think I do. And when I was reading his books, I often felt that when it comes to the Caucasus, when it comes to Iran. He is making some sloppy mistakes, or something things could have been explained better, and so on and so on. And what I didn't realize at the time is that that's the price of writing something general. It needs to be written, but it has to be also acknowledged that we are not omnipotent. There are lots of subjects that I and my co-author do not really know well. We are not specialists on European weapons. We are not specialists on 19th century tribal structure of Arab Peninsula. We are not specialists on Bronze Age items, and so on and so on. These things, while they do not directly relate to our subject in question, they sometimes come up during our discussion. And we have to be knowing that we are not, we have to know that we are not the greatest in these subjects. And you, the readers, also have to keep in mind that these particular details is something that needs to be addressed in publications that focus on these particular details. For example, Bronze Age and European weapons, and so on and so on. With this in mind, I would like to also mention briefly that I think as we go towards more general understanding of the subject, towards more pan-regional understanding of the subject, what we are going to see is the evolution of our studies overall. And I think that arms and armor definitely goes through three stages everywhere. First stage is mythological. So the earliest swords at our disposal, why were they preserved? Well, probably because they were associated with some legendary king or with some legendary battle. Now, this association usually comes into being not immediately after the battle. It comes into being hundreds of years later, and it starts to present itself as a postulate, as something unshakable in its truth. And usually the earliest research is always done on the basis of these descriptions. And one thing you can clearly see in works of these researchers is that they have no ability whatsoever to date swords. Because look, you have this sword which is attributed to the 11th century king, and identical sword which is attributed based on this kind of stories to the 14th century king. Now, what it means is that there is no way for you to detect any kind of evolution. And for some reason, a lot of people feel very proud that they kind of found something that can be interpreted as evidence that this sword form didn't change for thousands of years. Though in reality, as you will see, these things do not really happen. Swords do change, do evolve, and relatively quickly on a 300-year time scale. Let's put it. That's the characteristic time scale that we see. So usually from this approach, you kind of migrate towards a more ethnic history approach, where you say that swords and artifacts and armor is basically kind of side evidence of the local history. So you have some historical events, and that's what produces these objects. So the problem here is that you perceive the evolution as purely determined by the local history, as a local continuous phenomenon, usually all the way from the Stone Age to modernity. And you emphasize their uniqueness while neglect the horizontal ties in the region. Now, I think that in terms of a lot of arms and armor studies that we deal with, we didn't reach this point yet. A lot of times we are still over here, somewhere in between those. But what I think is that eventually we will shift to this approach, which I am trying to advertise, which is that material culture, including arms and armor, is a technology. It propagates, it evolves, and in doing so, it is an interaction of technology with the local history and economy that determines its development. And economic emphasis is very important because actually a lot of diversity of arms and armor does not come from different functionality. It comes from the fact that different countries have different labor practices. They have different relative costs of manual labor or machines or resources. And because of this, they adapt very different technological processes to produce essentially the same kind of items. Now, one thing we need to mention is that there are people who prefer to work with images, like Persian miniatures or portraits. There are people who work with text. We personally prefer to work with the existing objects. And I will outline the differences between these approaches shortly onwards. But for now, I'm just going to say that when you deal with the existing objects, you are limited by a gap factor. What it means is that, first and foremost, you don't really find a lot of weapon container archaeology outside of a certain belt, which I would say goes through maybe Germany in the west and Scandinavia, and then it goes to the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and then it goes to Manchuria. That's where you find a lot of graves with swords, with armors, and so on and so on. But even there, you have a transition from conventional beliefs, from old beliefs, where people are defined by their job. So if you're a warrior, you're a warrior. You worship a god of war. You're prepared to be a warrior in the next life. You need your tools. You have a certain blood bond between you and your tools. And you go from this to modern religions, and they say, well, it doesn't matter who you are in terms of your job. What matters is that you're a moral person. So it depends on your morality, what you're going to do in the next life. And that, of course, has a completely different meaning in terms of the burial customs and whether you need your swords with you in afterlife or not. So in the Middle East, this kind of things happened very, very early on. Towards the more northern countries, it's actually relatively recent development. So you talk about introduction and solidification of Buddhist power in East Asia and Christianity and Islam towards the West. But the problem is that the arsenals and the shrines and the temples that did contain some kind of collections of weapons, they did not really survive from those ancient times. So you have kind of a disappearance of weapons from graves, and thus their disappearance from archaeology overall, because other than graves, we don't have that many finds at all from archaeological sites. And you still do not have arsenals that will preserve this kind of weapons. Now, in some places like the Caucasus, Iran, the arsenal collections at our disposal today are relatively modern. When it comes to Moscow, they're a little bit older, but again, for example, Kremlin arsenal was really damaged in the early 17th century. Most of the swords there are from the mid 17th century or later. This is the earliest weapons that you find there in some abundance. Again, in Europe, they're not that early where you start finding arsenals with some Islamic weaponry. A lot of those come from some diplomatic efforts on the part of the Ottoman Empire or Persia, in particular Safavid Persia. There are some early Mamluk arsenals, especially the one we really will talk about a lot in the book is the Alexandrian arsenal, which still preserves some 13th century and 12th century weapons. So that's a very, very big change. In the East, a very outstanding case are those of Shosoin and other Japanese arsenals, which actually did function continuously from the 8th century, and they do have some 8th century weapons. So that's definitely a very important source for knowing period East Asian weapons. So can images be useful in our studies? And they definitely can be, and they definitely should be used. But there are a couple of things one needs to be constantly aware of. First is that dating images is actually much harder than you can assume. Royal portraits were redrawn all the time, so you would have 19th century portraits depicting 16th century people. Portraits were always periodically restored, and trust me, if in the 19th century somebody might have had some doubts about repainting faces, but swords and some kind of armor elements would be repainted in a second. Nobody would hesitate to change them to a more modern look. Also, sometimes portraits were copied, or they were restored, copied to the point that we have a completely new work at our disposal. Very common, you have 19th century family acquiring larger estate, larger palace, larger house, and suddenly they need a portrait of their ancestor, and all they have is maybe some 17th century drawing or 17th century oil which is already damaged by soot beyond recognition, and they hire somebody to paint in the 17th century or 16th century or 18th century style, and to paint the likeness of this person. And then we wonder, why does he have 19th century pistols wrapped around his belt? Such things, such cases are well known. Now, when it comes to more useful things, like, for example, Persian miniatures, they're fantastic works, and you look at them and say, wow, it's so much detail, so much realism, such a craftsmanship. But look at them a little bit closer. Well, you find these two guys, well, they definitely don't like each other. They're probably from some opposing armies. They are armed in exactly the same way, exactly the same swords. Now, part of it is because, well, yes, swords at the time from different countries, 16th century, they were not that different. But part of it is actually what we see in miniatures, that they like depicting people with exactly the same weapons. So everybody wears a sword. Everybody wears exactly the same sword. If they kill each other, it's probably going to be with swords, to the much lesser probability with bows or spears. Bow shot death is not as noble as being cut down with a blade. So it's not depicted as nearly as often. And trust me, you're not going to see people just trampled by horses in any great abundance. So another thing is that when they depict a sword, you don't see any signatures here. And typically, for some periods, you would expect them. You usually don't see any fullers. Again, so now no cutouts, no grooves in a sword. Some artists would depict them, others would not. You typically get the shape right, and you get kind of a general construction right. So you can say, okay, the swords they used at this time were not that curved, or they had yoman, or they had a simple hilt like this. These are the kind of things you can use for your judgment. Now, when it comes to European drawing, sometimes you go into periods where everything becomes very stylized. So you look at a sword, and in contrast to Dürer and his generation, who were complete realists, fantastic in detail, here, okay, it's something curved, it's something grotesque. Okay, there's something at the tip, maybe it's a Yoman, maybe it's something else. Who knows? So images are very useful when you want to detect when for the first time the weapon was used, when it first appeared. But you have to be very, very careful with their dates. You have to be very careful with information you get from them. Now, just a little bit talking about the geography that we will be covering. A lot of it will be about the nomadic past, because nomadic nations are really the only connection between the East Asia and Eastern Europe and the Middle East and the Europe proper during this time. The thing that happens is that you have the Pontic-Caspian steppe over here, which is a triangle between Volga, Don River, and the northern Caucasus. And that's the center, the tremendous center of nomadic cultures, all the way from Yamna and until the Crimean Tatars of the 18th, 17th centuries, when they still were managing to hold on to these territories. This is where you have the best grazing ground. This is where you have tremendous wealth of metallurgy in archaeological finds. This is where you find really everything that relates to nomadic culture, to this path, at its very best. Then you have sort of a gap until Altai Mountains. Not really a lot of things are found here. And here you go into sort of East Asian hub, where really you see a very, very strong lateral interaction between the cultures involved here, and they form somewhat separate tradition from the tradition out west. So here you go, Eastern Europe, it sometimes propagates to Central Europe, and in this path it propagates to the Middle East. So these are the basic things that we will have to consider when we study the propagation of technologies from west to east and vice versa, which are especially important in understanding of the evolution of the Eastern saber. Now we basically classify all the evolution of saber into a few periods. And each period is defined by some trends and by some dominant types, which really remain more or less constant during the period's duration, which is typically 250 to about 300 years. The first period would be until 600 AD. So that's kind of what sets the stage for the introduction of saber. And during this time, we see some pressure of Western or Germanic forms, a double-edged, long, broadsword coming from the west to the Ukraine. And basically, this goes mostly with Gothic tribes. That's what you see on this side. On this side, you see basically Bronze Age design in China being now transformed into Iron Age execution. And you see their double-edged sword. The form you start seeing it all the way to the west and the Pontic-Caspian steppes sometimes, and it also pushes eastwards as well. You also see that this form will transform a double-edged Chinese sword, which will never be completely replaced by the Chinese saber. But you also start seeing, and that's what's important, a single-edged, straight, long sword, which is sort of probably the original form from which all the consequent single-edged swords developed. And that includes a proper saber, which we define as single-edged curved weapon. So its origin is probably in China, and we start seeing that in the first period, this form already makes itself very comfortably towards the east in Japan, and it starts pushing westwards. It basically reaches the Altai Mountains at this point, but there is no evidence whatsoever until 600 AD that you really have a massive, massive transition of anything, any kind of weaponry to the west of Volga River towards the East Asian forms. You really don't have the cases where you bring this kind of swords in large enough numbers that you actually see them becoming the dominant form here. So in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, you see initially some Roman artifacts, and you see these Gothic thoughts. You see some Chinese artifacts like mirrors. You see sometimes parts which can be interpreted as some parts of Chinese swords. You also see a lot of designs which are again this very conservative things inherited essentially from Scythian period. Again, sometimes probably with some East Asian intermediate help. That's essentially old Bronze Age looking daggers that are now being elongated towards the sword length. So that's what you see in this first period. Tremendous diversity of forms, each region essentially having its own history and having its own weapon. And it's something that we are going to see will change completely during the second period. So the basic evolution that we see in the period is that we go from this form, which centers around China, and basically it's a straight single-edged design with a ridge usually quite close to the edge. And we go towards something that becomes more popular from Japan to Altai, which is a modification where you have the ridge moving towards the center of the blade. And there is now this double-edged construction, double-edged tip, which we call yoman. And yoman is just basically borrowing a Turkish word used for later weapons designs where you change geometry around the tip to facilitate stabbing, like in this case. So you have a spear-like tip, or to actually adjust the width of the blade for cutting, for better cutting. So this kind of designs, we see them coming to the west, to the Pontic-Caspian steppe, in exactly identical form. So we get exactly double-edged tip, the ridge usually close to the center of the blade. Even sometimes you have a fuller along the back edge, again, typical East Asian design. There are a couple of things you see that are different. First is that there's a uniform curvature very often in the Pontic-Caspian steppe in Khazaria, which is a proper saber, which is very different from anything we see at the time in China or Japan or Altai. Another thing is, again, so now in this period we already have some regional changes to this pan-Asian designs, is that in Japan the tang is usually tilting towards the back edge. In Altai and Khazaria, the tang is usually tilting towards the sharp edge. Very big difference. Another big difference is in terms of fittings. So in the East Asia, under Japanese influence, I would say, we have this spread of a guard called tsuba. So the disc-like guard, which is intended to be viewed from above the sword, from this direction. And everywhere else, especially in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, we have, again, aside from East Asia, we have conventional cross guards. We also start seeing habaki. Habaki is a cover which is placed underneath the guard. Its purpose is most likely to protect the scabbard from being cut, but we will see that it might have some other functionality as well. So just to briefly repeat the main point, what we have during the second period is the Pan-Asian dominance of one type of forms, which is basically a straight single-edged blade, usually with some kind of a ridge construction. And it goes all the way from the modern Ukraine to Japan in the east. Most of this westward expansion is due to the Khazars bringing with them this kind of swords in the 7th century, something we don't really see with other previous migrations, such as Han migrations, where the introduction of East Asian forms was very, very limited. So we also start seeing a lot of regional differences, so different tiltings of the tang, most importantly, appearance of a curved form in the west, so the proper saber, and that basically sets the stage for the next period, which will be associated with a much stronger regional diversity of the form. So we have a Pan-Asian globalist period, which is going to be transformed into the next region. Talking about the third period, which starts with the late 10th century, we really would like to start this discussion with the sword of Charlemagne. And that's a very famous weapon, which was supposed to have been dug out by the Emperor Otto from Charlemagne's grave in the 10th century. A very decorative, very, very beautiful piece, which, however, was analyzed probably by every single researcher in the field without any consensus on what it is. Most researchers assume it's 10th century, but believe that it cannot be attributed to Charlemagne's time. I think that even 10th century attribution is cowardly because it ignores many of the features that are clearly later that could have existed in the 10th century, but there is not much evidence that they did. So more natural attribution would be to say that the legend about this piece being dug out from Charlemagne's grave is not a historical document that you can take as a proof, and really you have to consider the age of this saber based on your own observation. So what are the key features of this sword? Well, the first key feature is that it has very long yeoman, which is essentially half of the blade. That's something that is really unknown in the steppe tradition. You don't find such swords in Hungary, you don't find them around Don River, you don't find them in North Caucasus. And that's a very key point. This is not a steppe tradition, period. Where you do find such blades is in the Ottoman tradition. So in the Ottoman tradition, you occasionally, on the very, very early weapons that you assume to be dating to the 15th century, the yeoman can be, well, at least a third of the blade. So you can hypothesize that, well, it's definitely gets shorter from the 15th century to the 17th century. Maybe it's got shorter from the 12th century or 11th century to the 14th. So the second thing is that the blade is completely straight. Well, there's maybe a little bit of curvature over here, but it's straight overall. That's, again, not something very consistent with the steppe tradition per se. Again, something that we see in the Ottoman tradition, and that's a photograph from Yusuf's book, a wonderful book on the early Islamic swords. It's mostly straight swords. Another thing is broad fuller. So you see this kind of cutout and it goes all the way from the back edge to the center in Cuman. Again, something completely unknown in the steppe. In the steppe, we would still have a fuller, if we would have one, in accordance to the East Asian tradition, where the fullers are to be placed along the back edge. This, however, placement of the fuller is again reminiscent of the Ottoman tradition. It's exactly what happens there. It goes in the kind of center to the back edge location, and then goes directly to the center in the Yeoman. The Yeoman here is widening compared to the width of the rest of the blade. Again, something you see on the Ottoman swords. You don't see it very often on the steppe swords, and certainly not really in the 10th century. Another thing is very interesting. That's it's decorated with a panel on which we have this kind of twisted dragons chasing each other. And this is again something we do find on excavated swords, usually around North Caucasus. And usually the graves are dating to the 12th century. There are some exceptions, but nothing really going all the way to the 10th century. Another thing, it has downward sloping guard. Can be 10th century element, but most of such guards are somewhat later. It has a very unusual hilt. So you see it straight over here, then it tips like this. It has very large pommel. It has belts over here. And these kind of things, again, we find. We find them in real life. We find these large pommels. We find them in archaeological data. We find these belts on the hilt, varied in geometry, but we do find them in the 12th century. This is a tradition, that's probably the last tradition that exists connecting Eastern Europe, connecting the Pontic-Caspian steppe to the East Asia. That if you look at Japanese items from the 12th century, you also find there's a change in the curvature of the hilt. There are these finger guards that become very, very prominent. And you see similar things in the 11th, 12th century in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. So we don't really know what was happening in the Middle East. We don't really know how the Middle Eastern guard or Middle Eastern sort of saber type looked like at the time. We can guess, but not much more than that. And definitely this is something that very similar to North Caucasian examples of the 12th century. The final word, which is decorative motifs, geometric motifs, very, very well done. Typically, prior to the 10th century, you don't really find many decorated examples in North Caucasus or the Pontic-Caspian steppe. That's true. If they are decorated, it's going to be in a conservative, kind of Gothic tradition, and definitely not something close to this style. Geometric motifs also can be very, very hard to date and attribute because they tend to be similar to one another. What we would argue is that, again, decorated swords that have geometric motifs is something, again, associated with the 12th century North Caucasus, specifically graves of us. We would like to say us chieftains, but would say just high-end us artifacts, high-end us weaponry. Us is a dominant nation in the Pontic-Caspian steppe and in the North Caucasus in the time. So I would very strongly argue that the blade is definitely the earliest example of the Middle Eastern tradition that later will become the Ottoman sword. Most likely it's associated with Seljuks of Iran. At least it's highly unlikely to be anything related to Hungarian tradition, to which usually attributed. It has no functional elements that match Hungarian design over here. It doesn't really match steppe designs overall. So it could be in theory Caucasian, but most likely this is a Middle Eastern piece, 12th century. The mounts are probably 12th century. and they're probably associated with us people. One has to remember that us people made it to Hungary. They were actually expelled or eliminated by Mongols almost entirely. And in the 14th century, a number of them actually resettled in Hungary. So if this sword was acquired in the 14th century, that could be a likely explanation. The dominant theme of the third period, and there are actually two dominant themes, is that first you have creation of new types of weapons, and first and foremost in Japan, and to the less extent in China. And these types serve as prototypes essentially for the next 1,000 years of evolution. So Japanese weapons from the 19th century are going to be quite similar to those from the 11th century, but not to those from the 9th century. Similarly, in China, you don't see as much change following the 10th, 11th centuries as you would see before that. It has to be noted that you see this appearance of saber in Japan, a curved form, and it seems to be completely independent from early appearance of curvature in the Eastern Europe, in Khazaria. And the reason you can make this judgment is that in Japan, it's a continuation of the tang being tilted towards the blade. So actually, the earliest blades, the curvature starts around the tang. In the West, actually, the curvature is uniform throughout the blade. So it's very obvious that the way, the route by which the curvature form is arrived to is very different in these two cases. So in the West, what happens is essentially there's not so much change in design. Basically, you have a change in proportion in terms of the broad swords being replaced in the Middle East gradually, and in terms of the straight single-edged form being replaced everywhere by a curved single-edged form, by a proper saber. So as it propagates, and as I already mentioned, it pushes away the broadsword form. You see that the path is from Hungary to the Byzantine Empire, and also from the north to Seljuks of Iran, and from there to Egypt. And essentially, Egypt and Syria, the Mamluk state, is probably the last one to adopt curved single-edged form in the Middle East. So those are the dominant trends that we have in this time. Now, just a little bit outline what kind of designs, period designs we're talking about. Is the broadsword form is rather similar to European contemporary sword, to which it really is a removed second cousin of swords, because the origin is exactly the same. Actually, when it comes to other sword forms, we have a slightly greater diversity, one might say. But diversity is mostly, and the development is mostly occurs, interesting enough, not so much in the blade itself, but in habaki, and that's the iron cover we already discussed, and in the hilt. And it's a very common theme actually with weapons that the fittings are partially because they're made from soft metals, partially because they're usually made locally. It's easier to change them. They change faster, and they faster become regional rather than global in their design. And what we see is basically habaki becomes more and more complex, and by its complexity, you can relatively well determine what's the date we are dealing with. It's indispensable for dating. And we see that it starts with something utilitarian, then it elongates. And elongation, and though there are no really archaeological artifacts in Japan that would track it nearly as well, but there are some in Manchuria, we do see a similar thing occurring in East Asia. And that tells us that at the time, the purpose of habaki was probably not only to prevent cutting of a scabbard. There was probably something there that was more related to the performance. Maybe one would wrap one's fingers around this portion of a sword. Such grips are known in fencing. Another important thing that happens is that if the Khazar period was generally very utilitarian, generally very black and white, iron-based, Here we start seeing some decorative traditions, and particularly Ast tradition of the North Caucasus is very, very prominent. And we see animals being depicted on various objects. These animals are, again, they retain clear connection to the East Asian and through East Asia to the earlier Scythian tradition. So you have Scythians from the Pontic-Caspian steppe going to East Asia, and then this style sort of apparently rose back to the extent. We see this kind of a geometry again with large pommel, with extra curvature on the top, with finger guards, something again that clearly relates to a lot of East Asian objects of the time. And that's probably the last exchange between the East Asia and the Pontic-Caspian steppe. We see identical solutions appearing in both at about this. So the fourth period in our classification, it starts around 1250 AD and ends in the 16th century. It's associated with two major phenomena. First, the Mongol invasions, and the Mongol invasions, we argue, do not really bring a lot of weapons-wise from the East Asia. They bring a lot of artistic traditions. They bring a lot of other technologies like casting coins, but they do not bring a lot of weapons. So what they do, however, is they sort of equalize much of the western portion of Asia in terms of weaponry. We start seeing the same helmets being used all the way from Moscow to Egypt and India, partially because Mongols bring a kind of the post-Caspian steppe developments into the Middle East, and also they become enamored with the Middle Eastern lifestyle, with the Middle Eastern technology, with the Middle Eastern culture, especially after adopting Islam as their religion. So you do see a lot of inputs from the Middle East to the north, and that plays a especially important role towards the end of this period. So when it comes to the Middle East itself, what we do see is first and foremost the complete dominance of Mamluk school. And we are going to talk a little bit about it. And essentially, I would say that in the book, originally we wrote chapters that looked like basically different dates. So basically, you look at the fourth period versus the third period, considered as the period, not as some kind of regional schools. And very quickly we realized in the process of writing the book that that completely doesn't make any sense, because when you talk about the Middle East in the 14th century, in the 15th century, in the 16th century, it's the dominance of Mamluk tradition, the dominance of Mamluk understanding of the sword. And you really have to write separately about Mamluks and separately about Iran and separately about the Ottomans. Now, the origin of the Mamluk tradition is, I would argue, Seljuk tradition of Iran. As we already mentioned, the broadsword remains in Egypt a dominant form until quite late. We find quite a few 15th century examples from Egypt and Syria, and definitely in the 13th century it was still probably the dominant weapon. What we find is a tremendous similarity between the earliest Mamluk sabers that we will consider shortly and the Seljuk work from what we believe 13th and 14th century. Now, the counter-argument immediately should be, well, how do we know these are Seljuk pieces? They all tend to come from archaeological digs in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. They're not particularly known to be dated. They are not dated at all. They have some writings in Arabic, but again, that doesn't prove anything. So first way to date them is that they have this very long habati, and as we said, habati and guard are two things that are very, very crucial to dating. On the latest pieces, we'll find them, the habaki forming this kind of very, very complicated shape, which will be copied by Mamluks in terms of signatures. So you'll find signatures on Mamluk weapons that occupy exactly this space, even with this kind of cutouts. These habatis are 14th century, basically, in most cases. Somewhat simple form, maybe the 13th century. So another thing is that you find the images of animals that are twisting like a branch, something we already saw on the sword of Charlemagne, and something that is clearly indicative of this 12th century decorative weapons tradition, and again, based on the signatures, based on the provenance of some of the pieces, we would argue that those come from Seljuk Iran. So why they can't come from Mamluks directly? So let's say, can it be just a Mamluk school all along? So it's just early Mamluk saber, if it's so similar to the later Mamluk work. Well, there are three arguments against. First is that Mamluks were very well known for signing their work, especially with the names of owners. Plenty of 13th century Mamluk swords, broadswords, signed by owners, dated. None of these pieces are. Something completely different. Second is that we do find this kind of decorations, this kind of animals in the 12th century material. 12th century material is a little bit too early for Mamluk saber tradition, based on many uh, considerations, including the art of the period, including the existing objects. We do not believe that Mamluks actually used sabers in the 12th century. So again, it will argue that these are actually Seljuk pieces. The third argument is that actually what you see here is a number of things that you do not find ever on any pieces associated with the Mamluk arsenals. You see habaki. Mamluk pieces have signatures that look like habaki, but not habaki proper. You see geometry with a central ridge, which clearly related to the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This is something that directly in contact with the Pontic-Caspian steppe. What you find on Mamluk pieces is something more advanced. You do not find Mamluk signed works that look exactly like this. So what you do find on Mamluk pieces is, especially when it comes to the 15th and the early 16th century, is very complicated decorative ornamentation, carved images, medallions with beasts, usually winged beasts. Um, Again, if you open the book, you will find that they're completely clear, certainly identified as lions or something else. We don't really know. Sometimes they look like lions, and those without wings are probably lions, and they were a very popular symbol. You also find those that look like dragons, and those that are probably griffins. Hard to tell exactly what animals are depicted. Um, many of the blades are signed, and in first, the earliest ones are going to be signed with the owner's signature. The later ones already signed with the makers. As Mamluk craftsmen attain regional popularity, they start to sign their work, and that's actually something that adds a lot of value, even back then, to these swords. You do see these signatures being imitated again for centuries, as is always the case with popular signatures in the sword world. So what you also see is the new material. Basically, around 10th century, you have transition from a typical earlier technology, which was the same everywhere, from Japan to Western Europe, which is a multi-piece construction, steel edge, iron core, probably because steel was very expensive. Differential heat treatment, again, probably because they recognized that heat treating iron is not the smartest thing to do. So that's the kind of thing you find before the 10th century. In the 10th century, you have a big split. You have Europe, which goes towards constructing huge facilities, which produce tons of steel at one load. And you go towards the Middle East, which actually goes towards crucible technology. But on the contrary, the processing is done for many days of very small, about 2 kilograms individual payloads. But that allows you to have much greater control over some of the properties of these steels, in particular their carbon context. So what you find, the evidence that a lot of these crucible steel made swords, and starting maybe with 13th, 12th century for certain, they have a very faint surface pattern, just lines parallel and running along the direction of the blade. And in the early 16th century, you start seeing this pattern becoming more vivid. So even without much etching, it's already present. And as we will discuss shortly, in the 16th century, you start seeing this pattern actually being made vivid on purpose, where it actually acquires some complex structure and actually becomes quite beautiful. So all these things, characteristic calligraphy, characteristic material, characteristic decorative style, owner's signatures, maker's signatures, they allow us to really identify Mamluk work very well. The only reason its importance was kind of downgraded in the research literature is because people like to study existing states. They like to study Turkish weapons. They like to study Iranian weapons. Mamluks are not as popular with conventional historians who work on kind of military history of a specific country. And basically, another thing that contributed to their lack of this well-deserved popularity is that they could make almost any shape of the blade you can imagine. So you cannot, based on the shape alone, judge that it's a Mamluk blade. You can guess, but you cannot make a definitive judgment. And that's, of course, complicates the matters because you have to train your eye to look for the small things, small differences in technology, but they are very often definitively Mamluk to the point they can clearly identify their work. Well, in this slide, we will give some intermediate conclusion, I guess, of our material. And it might look a little bit primitive, but that's essentially what we have here is the evolution of the original form, which is a straight single-edged sword with a ridge close to the edge, and it becomes very soon, it's still in the East Asia, a sword with the central ridge and double-edged Cuman, which then transforms into Khazarian saber. And from this point of time, we have actually evolution that occurs in parallel along two paths. We don't really understand the reason for such split. One path, which we call Tatar Mamluk, is the path where we have essentially uniform or close to uniform curvature throughout the blade, but at least more uniform than the other option, and the double-edged Cuman. And sometimes we have complicated footers, sometimes we don't have any. The key portions are the key moments are the curvature and the Cuman. The second tradition, I believe, starts with the Charlemagne sword, so with the early Seljuk weaponry. The key distinguishing factors are widening Cuman and the curvature, which is none in the upper portion and gets quite extensive around the Cuman. Why these traditions remained separate for such a long time? Why did they split so early on away from each other? We don't really know, especially since around 1500 the destruction of the Mamluk state resulted in a number of Mamluk craftsmen migrating to Persia, migrating to Turkey, spreading their technologies throughout the Middle East. And also you would think that the Seljuk tradition would be more uniform rather than supporting two separate paths. So there is some uncertainty here, and overall you do see very clearly this existence of two paths, but why they are such as they are is not entirely well known at the moment. Now, from now on, we are going to talk mostly about the Middle Eastern tradition, the evolution of Middle Eastern swords, particularly because starting with about 1500, that's the region which absolutely dominates the development. And not really much happens to the north, not really much happens in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Now, the fifth period in our consideration It begins around 1550 to 1600 AD, and it lasts about 200 plus years. And basically, it's associated with the formation of clear, distinctive Ottoman and Persian traditions that dominate the landscape completely. You have basically complete degradation of the Mamluk tradition, which kind of moves to become a part of either Persian or Ottoman tradition. You also have complete degradation of the northern Pontic-Caspian and other traditions that become, in many ways, simply repetitive and copying with respect to the Middle Eastern traditions. They retain some local conservative types, but those play only now a regional role and do not really influence the overall development of arms and armor that much. But one important thing to note, and that comes a little bit against to what I just said, that we have this clearly well-defined Ottoman and Persian traditions, is that besides those, there is one particular blade which is produced actually apparently everywhere in the Middle East. We find them with Mamluk signatures and Mamluk provenance. As here you can see the example on the right, it's a clearly Mamluk signature. The example on the left, and both of these come from Livrust Cameron in Stockholm. And you clearly see that the example on the left has a signature. It actually has some provenance. The provenance tells us that it's a Persian blade. The signature to me looks a little bit more Ottoman, but that's what the problem with these objects overall. They can have Ottoman signatures, they can have Ottoman provenance, they can have Persian provenance and signatures, they can have Mamluk provenance and signatures. They clearly developed from the earlier Mamluk style. So again, we are talking about a blade with relatively shallow curvature, relatively wide. Double-edged Yeoman, that's something that distinguishes it from Persian or Ottoman tradition per se. That's something more closely associated with the Mamluks. The signatures, the early signatures, tend to be the Mamluk as well. Now, the popularity of this sword in the Middle East is not really that well known, in the sense that actually a lot of those come from northern, meaning European or Russian collections. Where this, particularly in Russia, these swords were tremendously popular in the 17th century. So it might have been that the reason we see this unified type all over again with different signatures is because these were exported. So people in Egypt or people in Isfahan, they knew that if you want to make money on exports and you have a permission to do so, that's the kind of sword that you are going to make. So we might encounter a situation when maybe in Persia they were not nearly as popular as Persian exports to Moscow. But still, this is definitely an important sword, and we find quite a few of those. They can be a nightmare to attribute, and a lot of these kind of problems where you take one book and it says, okay, that's all these weapons are Persian, and another book that says all these weapons are Ottoman, is because people encounter blades like this, and they see, for example, Ottoman signatures or Ottoman provenance, and they use it as kind of canon, as the base for their investigation to the subject, and very soon they arrive to conclusion that a lot of blades are Ottoman, not realizing that this specific blade type was actually shared by all major Middle Eastern industries. So unless it's signed, unless it's provenanced, there's no way whatsoever to say where it was produced. And again, just because you find some example like this, you cannot use it to actually justify attribution of some other blades. In the 17th century, sometimes, well, you usually do not have any fullers, but in the 17th century, sometimes they have very complex fullers, sometimes double row fullers. It seems that this was somehow connected to Persia, and we know this from some Russian documents, and we know this from the fact that it is in the 19th century, 18th century Persia where we see kind of attempts to imitate this style. So It's again interesting to say that a lot of these blades with double fullers made in the 17th century, they go specifically to Moscow. And there is even consideration that some of those might have this double fuller system actually cut in Moscow. So again, we don't know whether it was purely local Persian traditional preference that made it to Moscow, or actually under the influence of imports to Moscow, Persians took note and they made some adjustments in Isfahan. But that's an important thing to consider. What happens during this period in Persia is first and foremost the development of Shamshir form. And when we say Shamshir, we usually mean just a very specific model that was popular there between roughly 1600 and all the way until 1900 or so. But of course, the meaning of this word is very generic. It's just any kind of long-edged sword in Persian. With this, it's very important, I think, to emphasize one particular fact when it comes to the terminology we use in arms and armor. And that's originally, if we are talking especially 10th century, 11th century, in most languages, we do not really have a lot of differentiation between different swords and between different types of swords. Most languages simply use just one name for a sword and maybe another name for a dagger. And that to some extent reflects the diversity that was present at the time. We have broadswords used in Europe, essentially all nearly the same, nearly identical to one another. These broadswords are also being used in Eastern Europe. They make it to Kiev, Rus, and we're going to see somewhat similar broadswords being used in the Middle East. On the other hand, you have sabers, which start to encroach from the Great Steppe. And again, these sabers are more or less of the same type, whether we are talking about those used in Hungary or those used in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, or those that are used by Seljuks in Iran. They are relatively similar to one another. So you really have massive use of essentially the same weaponry over large regions. And also you do not have a particular diversity in language. That's actually, it's worthwhile to point this out, because actually when I did some work a few years ago on analyzing texts, ancient texts about various battles and various engagements, in particular those of more poetic nature. And very often you read that, okay, we know this particular composition in its 17th century edition, but it's certainly a copy of 14th century original, and 14th century original was obviously composed by a poet who was actually on the battlefield. So when he writes about the death of this noble prince after slaughtering 200 enemies, he actually witnessed it directly. And while we have the 17th century copied, but that's just our luck. And multiple linguists stand behind this kind of analysis. But if you look at the terminology, what very often you find that these 17th century copies actually use 17th century terminology when it comes to weapons. And the difference is very drastic. You start with old texts that really don't have anything except a noun for just a general sword. And in the 17th century, most of languages, they already have some kind of a differentiation. So they use adjectives. They say beautiful sword, straight sword, Lithuanian sword. Or they actually invent new nouns. They go and say that this is a type of weapon, this has a specific name. The latter are not particularly common. And because of this, actually in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, when we start actually writing classifications of weapons, very often what we do is we take a particular type and we look for any name, maybe a completely generic name, in one of the languages used in the area, and then we kind of conscript this name to denote this particular type. So this is a purely 20th century, 19th century development in most cases. Shamshir is one of those. So we basically talk about a specific weapon noting that in the original language it actually has a much more generic meaning. So when this type first appears, and again, there's a particular controversy in the field about this, which I, to be completely honest, do not really understand, because to me, the subject of when Shamshir first appears is, well, it cannot be more clear than that, because at the time Iran is at the peak of its artistic tradition. You have tremendous quality of Persian miniatures. You have them in the most detailed, in the most exquisite form that ever existed. And you clearly see that the late 16th century, you still have swords that are more or less similar to what you saw before. And if we look, this are a little bit earlier images, for example, but still, what you see is okay, that relatively straight, large hilts in this case. The swords, they're curved, but not particularly, or they can be even relatively straight. They are wide throughout, so you don't really see a lot of tapering. If they are drawn out, you usually do see some kind of yeoman over here. You can't make a judgment whether they have fullers or not. You just see that these are not particularly strongly curved, relatively wide, not tapered blades, without any kind of clear indication regarding whether they are fullers or not, or what kind of signatures they had. These things you cannot say, but the general shape is quite clear. What you see in the early 17th century is you see that they start to appear with a carbell hilt, and there's we spend in the book quite a lot of time talking about different fittings, different mounts, and what does it mean. Here, as we said already, we are just going to talk about basic things concerning mostly the blades. It's enough to say that what we see is first and foremost change in mounts. We do start seeing sometimes that either the scabbards, or if we actually see the blades taken out, they are becoming very much curved and tapered. So wide at the beginning and uniformly narrowing towards the tip. And there is no discernible yeoman, or it's very small double-edged yeoman over there. So something completely different from before. Where do we have transition from this to essentially that? Well, again, miniatures are very useful in this kind of aspects. And they do show that Shah Abbas continued to use swords that were with relatively small curvature and relatively wide, probably of the older type. I know of one portrait that is probably showing him with a Shamshir. And again, the problem of using royal portraits is that those things were redrawn over time. You have Shah Abbas portraits that were painted in the 19th century. So there might be not the most reliable material, but still a very solid argument can be made that 1600 to maybe 1630 is the period where you have first introduction of Shamshirs. You don't really see them in miniatures before, and you do see only Shamshirs around late 17th century. So a complete change of weaponry. Another important thing that you see is that when you analyze examples with provenance, and Shah Abbas was very active in international relations. He did send out quite a few gifts, and those gifts are preserved in collections. And you clearly see that these are all the type swords, the ones that we considered in the previous chapter, in the previous period. And basically, you don't see any indication that during his lifetime, Shamshir form was popular to such extent that he would send it around. It might have existed, but it was certainly something that was just beginning to appear. Following Shah Abbas' reign, you do see Shamshirs with a solid provenance appearing in collections. It has to be noted that a lot of controversy simply emanates from signatures you find on Persian weaponry, and that's something we are going to address very shortly. So what we see is that there is a major split around 1670s. And before that, you have, again, Shamshir forms, and these are a couple of examples from Kremlin. We don't exactly know when they appeared in the collection, original collection, the first provenance. Probably it was 1620s, but there are arguments for actually somewhat later appearance. There are some conflicting opinions and research on this point. What we see is that many of them are quite wide. They sometimes made from woods, they're sometimes made from bullet, but it's relatively simple quality. The signatures are relatively crude. Very often they're stamped on the tank. That's something you would see on Mamluk weaponry, and that's definitely the style that came from Mamluks. Very often they are inlaid on the blade. Again, very kind of simple inlaying. They contain a personal name of the master, and among those, quite a few are Mamluk names. So you have al-Misris, you have other names that are definitely reference to the Mamluk genealogy. And this clearly serves an indication that quite a few Mamluk craftsmen actually made it to Persia and started to work there. And they brought with them not only the signature style, but actually quite a few other technologies as well. So that is something that what you see until 1670s. There are very few Shamshirs like this with a provenance. What you see after 1670s is tremendous numbers of Shamshirs all around. The mounts are not going to be Carabello mounts or any kind of old type of mounts, but this specific new Shamshir type of fittings. Also, what you see is essentially starting with 1675. Instead of individual craftsmen, you see most of the signatures just containing the name of Asad-Allah or a few other big names that appear on hundreds and thousands of blades. The signatures are also going to get very quickly very detailed, very exquisite sometimes, or sometimes just ambitious, but poorly carved. Nice and lay in most cases, very, very interesting structure. Quite a distinctive style. You don't really see it on weapons with provenance from earlier times. So, and that goes to the most famous controversy of Persian weaponry is that of Asad-Allah. In principle, when you have one name appearing on swords produced over the course of many centuries, in Asad-Allah case, I would argue that at least 80, maybe 90% of swords produced in the 18th century are bearing his name. And certainly we have 1860s blades still carrying Asad-Allah signature. Typically, it is something that you find in arms and armor extraordinarily often. Extraordinarily often. Most weapons are not signed at all. And then if you find a signature, you can expect it to appear for a couple of centuries and in more or less exactly the same form. The reason I think is that you sign weapons that you want to trade internationally, or at least in some large cities, not necessarily close to the place you work at. And for this purpose, you need a trademark. You need the signature to be recognized. If you change your signature every 30 years or so, it just doesn't make much sense because your customers are not going to be able to differentiate between your work or the work of your city and pay extra to acquire it. They're just going to be confused. So unless you have connoisseurs, unless you have collectors who really willing to dig through all the individual signatures, you just leave the matters to one trademark that is being used time and time over. And in particular, in the case of Asad-Allah, there is no indication that you can take some set of blades and say, okay, these are first-class works, and we assign them to Asad-Allah, the real smith, and everything else is a copy. No, they are all about the same in the sense that there are some really good ones, there are some really bad ones, but overall it's the same style, roughly similar craftsmanship. Again, strong variation of quality, but not something that you can say, okay, the ones made before 1690 are all very good, and that's a completely different craftsman than the ones that followed. You cannot distinguish first generation Asadullah. And that's a very common problem again. You would not argue that there is such thing as first generation Ulfbrecht in the European source. It's impossible to deduce the existence of such person. Maybe he existed, but you cannot just deduce which work is his and which work is that of his followers. Now, with Asadullah, the matter is complicated there in the sense that what you also find on these blades are very often names of Shah Abbas and some other important figures in Persian history. Nadir Shah, not that common, but Shah Tahmasp, occasionally encountered, and so on and so on. Also, you sometimes find dates that are very ambitious. You find dates from the 16th century, the 17th century, and so on. Now, the problem is that, again, these blades that supposedly belong to Shah Abbas and carry 17th century dates, they are indistinguishable from the late 18th century blades. And they are completely unlike what we find in terms of provenance examples that belong to the early 17th century. Moreover, Shah Abbas would never give anybody blade that was actually signed with his name. You find some early 17th century blades with the names of Persian Shahs, but the signature style is completely different. So what we have here is, to me, again, rather obviously attempts in the 18th century, in the 19th century, when Asadullah mark became highly recognizable, and the name of Shah Abbas was already legendary, to bring some extra value to a sword. Again, something very, very common. You find tons of Japanese swords signed with 13th century dates and names of Masamunis, and it's almost impossible to dig when they were made, 15th century, 16th century. You can just, based on the craftsmanship, make some guesses. Here, based on the craftsmanship, we guess it's really most 18th century and sometimes 19th century work. If we were to find a single example of such signed, such dated blade that would have a provenance, that would change the matters completely. But because such example was never found, and not, trust me, not for the lack of searching, and everything that we find with provenance to the early or mid 17th century does not bear anything like these signatures. There are no Asadullahs, there are no Shah Abbases, and so on and so on. I would not really concern myself with this kind of names, in a sense that it's just a trademark, it's just a writing, it's not a historical testimony. And of course, a really important development that we touched upon just a little bit when talking about the Mamluk work is appearance of a new technology, of a new type of steel. It's called bulat or woods. And again, there are many arguments about which name is the best. And I don't think it really matters as far as we know what it is. And what it is really a steel which exhibits vivid surface patterns. And these surface patterns are not obtained by any kind of carving or manual mixture of layers from different steels, although the folding and basic processing of steel, of course, does affect the way these patterns look like. These patterns are essentially a separation of steel into a few phases, and one is very carbon rich, and another one is more regular steel, as we can. Of course, steel is not really a single material. It exists in many different phases. There's cementite, there's a whole bunch of other possibilities, and it's just too complex a subject. And to be honest, I'm not a very great metallurgist to talk about it in this presentation. It's enough to say that all of these steels are obtained by crucible process, and they all contain relatively large amount of carbon. The surface pattern we first see in the 16th century, and it appears completely utilitarian. I would say with a lot of etching, we actually see it even earlier. Basically, all crucible steel process made blades, they all exhibit some sort of pattern. It's just very faint usually. And the crucible steel does appear maybe in the 6th or 10th century. I don't want to go again through all the history of this process over here, but what we see in the 16th century is a change from something that is fainted, utilitarian, to something that's vivid and recognized as a pattern. So you have a combination of burrs and lines of different contrast and so on and so on and so on. Now here I show just some of the best works in this media, in my opinion, and it's made by probably Armenian smith named Kirill, who lived in Tbilisi in the first half of the 19th century. And this particular blade is one of the most amazing examples. It's naturally pitch black with some actually blue tint if you look at it in the daylight, and it shows great variety of contrast, great variety of patterns. It's just something absolutely amazing when you look at the sword. But he also produced quite a few other works in woods or bulat that are just, they're looking just as contemporary Persian or contemporary Indian work. So what it shows is actually the same craftsman could actually produce a number of patterns, and depending on how much time he wanted to spend him out, what kind of materials he worked with, the result would also be quite different. Now, historically, woods, I would say, very hard to date, because the same patterns were used for a very long time. We know that the earliest patterns that we just consider the Mamluk patterns, they're really very faint and very short parallel lines. Later, we see basically Persian style being very, very large portion of the lines being parallel to the blade. They're all relatively long. There are some that kind of burrow in a perpendicular direction, and that's a very typical Persian work, mostly like this. What we find on Indian and Ottoman work, and we don't know why there is such similarity. Others Indians working in Turkey, Turks using maybe some experts from India in terms of, I don't know, already pre-made bars, or we don't really know why there is such a similarity. But we do find that they use materials that are much more chaotic, and you do see the lines that are in general can be very, very, very short, and you can still have some portions of the blade with sort of parallel lines running through them, but majority is, again, the orientation is everywhere. It really looks like some kind of a tree. Very, 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 very nice depiction of something that is grows in all direction. And actually, it's probably related again to how you fold the steel. That probably what determines how this is going to look in the final product. And there are even people who work with sorry, creating steps like this, and that takes a lot of effort. They probably make some cuts and again make kind of refill them with material, refold it around here. The process is amazing in terms of what it can produce. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful blades. Judging by the fact that the patterns are a little bit similar to the ones you find on Japanese swords, where they are obtained purely by folding, so there is no experimentation with the chemical context of material. You don't go to this very high carbon steels. Much of it relates really to folding and processing of the blade, but the contrast, the appearance of this kind of images naturally, that's definitely related to this high carbon context that you can obtain with the crucible method. And there are lots of speculations, and that's what you usually find in books or articles on woods or bulat, that there was an absolutely superior, absolutely ancient technology. Again, we don't really find evidence of vivid patterns before the 16th century, none whatsoever. And there is absolutely no evidence that it's this kind of super technology that's completely superior to all the steels. It's a very interesting design point, we would argue, because high carbon steels are naturally quite sharp. They're naturally quite hard. They do not require heat treatment, and they actually do not benefit much from a heat treatment. So it is a very interesting approach, but definitely, I would say again, people who claim that it's has an absolute hardness and it's superior to anything else, they all quote 19th century authors. They do not show any data whatsoever. So I would just assume it's yet another um, kind of legendary approach, mythological approach in our subject, but which we have unfortunately not any lack of. As we mentioned in the book, when we work with Ottoman arms and armor compared to early Persian artifacts, compared to Mongol items, compared to many other subjects, there are substantially fewer mysteries. So when you're talking about 15th century or 16th century Isfahan production, all of it has to be deduced. It means that there are no documents, there are no grand books that contain the answers. There are no foliants that you can study and say, this is 14th century Mongol made somewhere in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and these are 14th century but imported from somewhere, let's say from Mamluks or from Persia. There's nothing that tells you how to attribute and date pieces a priori. Basically, what you have to do is to produce hypothesis and then confirm it by comparing it against the existing data, against the existing artifacts, against the existing Persian miniatures, and so on and so on. So basically, we're talking about a lot of research, a lot of investigating, trying to create some kind of theory that allows you to date and attribute the items. It's a very interesting work, don't gonna get me wrong. It also, of course, means that you can never assume that you know the whole truth. You just see patterns that fit the existing objects. But unfortunately or fortunately, in Ottoman Samson armor, you have tremendous numbers of items with provenance. So you have property of various Ottoman sultans, extraordinarily well preserved, fully documented. You know when they were made, you know when they were retired, and you know when they were modified, if they were reheated, for example, or something like that. So you have kind of a lot of work with documents that can really reveal most of what you need to know, at least for certain centuries. And if you want to work with something very early, like the 14th century, you again run into the problem that really you are bound to work with something from archaeological finds in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, or to work with some early Mamluk arsenals, but you really don't have a kind of Ottoman sources per se. So we can't really say that it's a work with the Ottoman material. But when it comes to later centuries, again, it's a relatively well documented subject. Uh, However, it does contain a few proper mysteries. And one of them, I would say, that intrigued quite a few researchers in the past 3 decades or so. And I would call it the mystery of the golden images. And it's a nice mystery novel title, much better than the title I used for my book. So, unfortunately, sometimes one has to be more academically accurate than attractive when choosing a title. So what it concerns is that there are a number of swords, and it looks, based on the fact that they don't really come in one set of mounts, in some kind of single type of mounts, and they were clearly all remounted at some later time. So we assume that they came into being really as bare blades. But these blades all have one particular type of image. It's a Christian, you would say, icon. It has Madonna, and it has this nice cherubs. And another thing is that it has always these 2 candlesticks. In addition to those, and of course, finding these images on any kind of weapon of the time is almost impossible. And overall, Christian icons were not really placed on swords at the time. On top of this, they have typical Islamic, you would say, work, which includes elements like this. And actually, some of the signatures are in Arabic also, at least that I occasionally encountered. So these sword blades are often dated, and it seems that the earliest one was produced in 1685, and the last one was produced in 1692. It has to be said that when we put all facts like this in a structured way, it's already maybe giving you 3/4 of an answer. So a lot of problems with research, why people kind of drop all this and just go and with their theories, is that very often people postulate based on their status as an expert rather than try to actually present the data first. And then you have this book and it comes out and it has some statement saying that this sword is such and such, and then everybody quotes it, and you just lose the point that there should be some arguments made that actually explain the existing objects. And that's what we are trying to do here. So they were produced for a very short period of time. It looks like the blades are relatively random, just random period Ottoman blades. Some are from premier quality woods, some are just plain steel. They have weird signatures that combine not only sometimes Arabic, but mostly in Greek, includes quotations from the Bible of highly violent nature. You don't really often see them, even on weapons, even on European weapons, you don't really often see them. But sometimes there are also small signatures in Latin and or Italian. So very weird combination. Again, not something we do see on contemporary objects. Never mind that finding weapons produced in the Ottoman Empire in such a Christian style at the time is something quite unthinkable. So there were a lot of attempts to explain their existence. And basically, now it's, I think, very interesting point to illustrate that very often in arms and armor, we encounter this kind of ideas that there's a school to which all mysterious work which you don't understand is being attributed. So it's kind of a basket, and every time you see something strange, my apologies, you just say, well, these guys were very talented and they produced work over many centuries and they worked in a variety of styles, and boom, then we can attribute anything we don't understand to them. This school has no defining features, so it can be anything at all. And there are always this kind of throw everything in one corner baskets in almost every field of arms and armor. And in particular in the world of Turkish-looking weapons. For quite a while, this was the case with Lvov Armenians. And Lvov Armenians is something that we know about from multiple contemporary documents talking about their involvement in trading Western arms and armor to Mongols in the 14th century, and vice versa in the 16th century, probably in the 17th century, maybe to some extent, trading Turkish and Tatar arms to Poland. So very important route between Poland and the east, coming through the city of Lvov, and definitely tremendous participation of these traders. But there is no evidence they actually made any swords. There was one signed in Armenian, which was part of Lvov Castle collection. It disappeared in the Second World War. We know by photographs that it has a signature in Armenian, but it's also decorated in a Caucasian style. So my opinion is that based on the style of the signature, based on the style of decorations, it really comes from the Caucasus. And we know that in the Caucasus, Armenians played a tremendous role as swordsmiths, as silversmiths, as goldsmiths, especially in the city of Tbilisi. So again, if you're talking about early 19th century, Tbilisi artisans were absolutely premier in their work in the region, I would say overall in the East. And definitely this particular sword has much more to do with this culture rather than with some unidentifiable Lvov Armenian craftsmen. So when we talk about these swords, the one thing that people always pay attention to is these images, and that's what I'm trying to explain. But I think what really first and foremost should come up is that these were produced for a very short period of time. And almost all in the 19th century were either in Russia, I would say 90% of known examples were in various high-end Russian collections, and some were in Transylvania, some were in Saxony, and some were in Italy. And some, I mean, maybe one or two examples. Again, old collections, 17th century about, collections associated with the leading nobles. So it's clear that somebody made these blades probably to be presented to leading dignitaries of the time. And when we look at this kind of particular date, one thing that comes out is that those are exactly associated with the warfare in Greece, in particular Venetian occupation of part of Greece, as a part of Holy League's effort to combat Ottoman activity in Europe, let's put it this way. So we have the siege of Vienna, and after that there is a kind of a counter-strike that goes on multiple fronts, and it's a union which includes Russia. And in particular, it makes sense, I would say, that these blades are more or less belonging to the nobles that had decisive role in this conflict. In particular, Russia was very hard to woo because it had to postpone its semi-permanent war with Poland and accept some kind of mediation on the part of the Holy League in return for its participation in the war against the Ottomans. So clearly these blades are Ottoman, but they could not have been just brought from the Ottoman Empire and donated to its enemies. These were probably acquired in Greece, and that's why they're so diverse. They don't come from some bladesmith's shop. They were just picked up. There were probably no local bladesmiths who produced those. But there were probably quite a few goldsmiths. So goldsmiths working in Greece were perfectly able to create these complex images. And the Venetian control explains why you have a combination of Latin and Italian, but with statements in Greek. And signatures in Arabic, again, these people definitely worked in their craft under the Ottomans. So they had plenty of opportunity to learn how to copy these typical Islamic slogans, and they just, in a couple of cases, they just reproduced them on these plates. So, but overall, it's of course a very unique case of a Christian weapon produced with essentially Ottoman technologies, and the clear explanation, at least to me, that it is the only conditions that were able to set the ground for this limited series to be released is exactly the Mauryan War, during which time this kind of production took place. So again, the key here is that we do know that there is now other object that combines Greek, Latin, Italian, this kind of completely weird iconography. So it's clearly something that was very unique in creation. It's not something that was or could be produced on a regular basis in Constantinople or Lvov. There were just no other examples like this. So with this, we have to also now address what was happening during this period of time in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. And generally, what we see is that starting with the 15th century, and especially much more rapidly so, starting with about 1600, there is a rapid degeneration of the local production capabilities. What is it associated with? Is it because Ottomans and the Tatars they have difficulties with Genoese colonies? And we have to remember that most Tatar states, we have some evidence today that they produced coinage, for example, through these Genoese colonies, that they bought arms and armor from Genoese traders, and these arms and armor were either imported from Europe or produced on the spot or imported from the Mamluk Empire. So they had this tremendous relationship with the Genoese, and it's definitely running dry in the 16th century. So whatever local capability existed, it really doesn't do much after 1600. Now, what happens is the development of arms and armor. And here, the good news, when you make a presentation rather than publish a book, you can actually steal lots of photographs from the internet. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do over here. I'm showing you the photographs of these illegal digs. This would be a 14th century Tatar-Mongol saber that would be used in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. So you see, you already recognize a very, very telling hilt with a long habaki. But this one, you can see it has unusually sharp tip. And that's actually the kind of local conservative form that does, unlike most of the Tatar weaponry from the region, it is not affected by their friendship with the Middle East. It's not affected by their fascination with the Mamluks and later Persian arms and armor. It's something that is a local type that's being retained. So what happens is it starts to develop in this weird weapon that, unlike all more modern trends, it retains the reach for a very long time. So 15th century, everybody else is already trying to get rid of the reach structure as much as they could. This weapon has still very pronounced central reach. And this central reach transforms in the tip in this kind of bayonet-like structure. Very, very effective for stabbing. Definitely much more so than just a simple Yeoman adaptation. And we see that in the 16th century, this becomes a very, very, very long. These things reach about 140 centimeters of total length. Seldom so. Usually they are about 105 to 120 centimeters. Heavy weapons, 1.2, 1.4 kilos, with a very, very well-defined tip of very unique configuration. It's almost kind of bends in the opposite direction from the rest of the sword. Now, what we find in the 16th century, that apparently many of them now are actually made by somebody associated with Iran, in the sense that we find Iranian signatures, we find some evidence of Iranian production. Early 17th century, we find a lot of them now made from woods, bulat. So there are imports that are custom made for this region. A very unusual weapon. It is imitated sometimes in Moscow, which also uses quite a lot of similar weaponry. Very often we call it Tatar-Cherkassan saber, in recognition that it was really used all the way in Eastern Europe, from Poland and basically to Crimea, to North Caucasus, and then back north to Moscow. But Crimean Tatar Khanate was the main source of this culture at the time, and Cherkassians were instrumental in retaining this kind of culture, this kind of design from the earlier times, and transmitting it into this new form, which is again, retains all the conservative features of the earlier designs, except that the reach now also kind of gone. What happens around 1620, maybe 1640, is a very rapid transition that this kind of bayonet tip blades are abandoned very quickly. And what we start seeing is that is very simple trade blade of the kind that we discussed many, many times already, with basically shallow curvature, either without any kind of fullers or with, like in this case, a double row of fullers. Usually they bear either Persian or Mamluk signatures or no signatures at all. So almost all of them are probably imports. And they have a typical double-edged Yeoman over here. Typical, just 17th century pan-Middle Eastern saber that originates probably from the Mamluk design. as we already discussed, but was really popular in Eastern Europe. And that's something what we see in the 17th century and the 18th century being used. Again, I'm not aware of a single example that we would consider for certain a local production. I know of one which was probably made somewhere in the Caucasus, but probably is just a stretch at this point. So majority were imported. So around 1600, 1640, that's where we have real destruction of whatever local production capability that existed and final orientation towards the imports. So with this we come to the sixth and final period in our consideration. It starts around 1770 AD. As before, we see that it really introduces itself simultaneously in the region from Japan in the east all the way to Balkans in the west. And in particularly in its western portion, it's associated with a tremendous dominance of regional styles, resurgence and dominance of regional styles. Every time you see somebody and he tells you that he collects ethnographic Eastern weapons or he collects some specific tribal weapons, let's say ancient, I don't know, I don't want, I'm not really great specialist on tribes, but ancient, let's say Bedouin sabers or Caucasian or Kurdish or something else of the kind. You're really talking about somebody who collects things made after 1770 AD. It's not very often admitted. It's very often assumed that these weapons existed before, and many of them are based on some examples or some trends that were evident way before 1770 AD. But they never attained the power, the value, and the importance that they attained in this period. So that's something that has to be clearly stated. So we see basically the region that has about the same size as the one we studied before, but we have now Central Asian shashkas, Bukharan shashkas, Afghani shashkas. We have a new type of shamshir. We have Caucasian shashkas and sabers. We have Bedouin sabers. We have Ottoman swords. Again, new type of Ottoman swords. We have Balkan swords. In many cases, we're talking about not a diversity of blades as much as diversity of fittings and decorative styles. And that's very, very obvious, always the case, that fittings change faster and they always tend to be more regional than the blades. But one thing that enables this kind of diversity on the part of blades is that a lot of blades now become trade blades. So we see, for example, unprecedented use of blades that were probably produced in Persia, in Egypt, in Turkey, so in basically southern Caucasus, everywhere. And these blades are actually shaped to fit the local weaponry patterns. So they're custom made for the export to this region. We see tremendous use of European, my apologies, of European blades that are trade blades, that are typical period local hussar blades that are being exported to the region and fitted with different mounts, with different hilts, resulting in the production of different weapons. So here is a particularly important case of this type of trade blades, and we assume that they come from Persia. Part of the reason is that sometimes they still contain signatures of Asad-Allah that we know from the previous period. Part of the reason is that the work in woods is really of Persian type, and there are other considerations as well. But what we see here is that they're actually quite unlike in spirit to anything that was produced in the past few hundred years in Persia. First of all, they have medallions. And the image in this medallion is usually interpreted as a lion and sun, and it's probably to some extent correct. We do see that in Persia at the time, the image of lion and sun becomes popular. And again, when it comes to such images as hexagram, as lion and sun, Very often people just go to Wikipedia and they read there that's okay, this image was used for hundreds and thousands of years. It's an ancient symbol. Yes, it's sort of true, but it was used by a cabal of maybe 30 intellectuals and never really interpreted as a national symbol or found on any single sword produced. It's something that we see in the 18th century, in the 19th century, that the symbols used in the Middle East, they change. Before, seeing an Ottoman Sultan's toga was something special. Now it was on a birth certificate. Before, seeing a hexagram meant that you are uh, privy to some advanced discussion on mysterious, probably, aspects of phase, and now it was on every amulet produced and sold on the market. The same thing that light and sun we do start seeing particularly often already in the 19th century, and particularly related to, again, firearms and cannons and so on, where the state symbols usually appear first. But it's also worthy to know that really this medallion-based signatures is not something we associate with Persian tradition. This is a clear referral to the Mamluk tradition, where medallions with beasts, that was their mark. And of course, in the Ottoman consideration, we also don't find anything like this. Well, we find some imitations of Mamluk work, and that's about it. Here we do see something that the image is very close to the Mamluk origin. This sun on the back was originally a wing, and this beast was not a lion but a dragon. So a winged beast, which can now be interpreted also as light in the sun, but is still drawn as Mamluk winged beast. We see long signatures, just like Mamluk weaponry would have, with large squarish letters. Again, very, very clear reference to Mamluk times. We see complex fullers very often in two rows, used by Mamluks, but also apparently used in Persia in the 17th century. All of these examples, they show a very typical trend of the 19th century Middle East, is an attempt to reference what was seen then as the golden age of Islam, as the golden age of Islamic military, the 16th, the 17th century, relative golden age. So they appear around 1770 AD. They get extraordinarily popular around 1800. A lot of swords brought by Napoleon's army from Egypt, they have this kind of blades. They were used throughout the Middle East. We do find them mounted in many, many different ways. Again, mostly probably, especially in Egypt and Syria, were especially popular. But that's a typical trade blade of the time. Now, if you go to see the contemporary Ottoman work, it also changes around 1770. So there's a new type of sword, and that's has many distinctive features. Again, we're trying to go to some more complicated fullers. Again, we are trying to have sometimes these blades actually have the same signatures that we just discussed, and they probably were Persian experts as well. We're trying to see some decorations over here. Unfortunately, I don't have a close-up, but usually lower quality work, kind of ambitious but hastily done. But on some examples, it's really first-rate imitation of the early Mamluk signatures, and again, even with using Kufic script, which Mamluks were not that familiar with, but again, it's referencing the golden age of Islam. It's a very nostalgic weaponry all around, very nostalgic style. The fittings become very garish and simplistic at the same time. So we see some white metal. In some cases, it's silver alloy. In some cases, later cases, it's simply nickel alloy with just some ripasse or other similar lower quality work. We also see a lot of regional styles. For example, we see Balkan work, with very characteristic complex images on the hilt, and it's definitely the popularity that is becomes defining of the period that we do see regional styles, especially in decoration, something we did not really see to any such extent before. Even more telling is a set of weapons or style which collectors call Khazar style or Khazar revival. And it's basically addresses a range of artifacts. And some of those are relatively well made and they're quite stylish, and definitely the quality is substantial. Um, those are probably early, and I would say that the earliest we know is probably 1820. Unfortunately, these pieces, the Khazar pieces overall, are almost never signed or dated. There are some that are signed with, again, some big names, but as we know, I personally do not trust big names on Persian weapons. Those were considered collectible, and thus you cannot completely rely on them without any kind of confirmation. So, very nice work. What is interesting about it is that it tends to come as a set. So you don't just have a sword. You really have a number of items produced with this kind of decorations. You have armor, full sets of armor. Later, you have daggers of various types. You have the straight broadswords. You have, again, shamshirs that would be wider, more bulky, more grotesque. And later the decorations become truly, truly obnoxious, one would say, covering the entire surface of the object. Shallow carving, clearly with the use of etching, extensive use of etching. The imagery becomes very also grotesque in its direct sense of this word. Uh, Horned beasts, demons with multiple hands, and so on and so on and so on. Something that might relate to different mythological publications, some more mythological pages in Shahnameh, and so on. So again, tremendous quantity of these weapons being produced, and there are multiple ways to look at what they were needed for. There are people who believe that those were actually used in Persia and they had some ritual or mystical side to them. It's hard to see why such a large number of mystical objects would be required. It's even harder to explain why almost none of them appear in the contemporary Persian photographs, because Persia at the time was a country very, very often photographed, and especially some kind of ethnic and local and ancient rituals were very often subject of this kind of reporting, and we seldom see these items in this context. Where we do see them is foreign collections, especially Russian ones. And they exist there in very, very large numbers, and they all come from Oriental rooms that somebody furnished, let's say, around 1910. So I would say that these are souvenirs, and they really have, style-wise, especially the later objects, they don't really have much to do with the earlier Persian work. The quality is also not there. They were just mass-produced to be sold to the West, and especially to Russia. Well, that's essentially the end of um, local and to some extent Islamic web arms and armor tradition. You go to the point where the true local crafts cannot be supported, and initially at least they try to produce some very, very high class objects that are still traditional in many senses. They're still an example of beauty of the local style, but then they very quickly degenerate into something that is very showy, very touristy, but completely meaningless. So thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure to present this material, and I really appreciate an opportunity to be here. In case if you want to see much more about this subject, please purchase my book. Of course, it's much easier to discuss this kind of variety of theories and objects and data in a 360 pages book rather than in a 1.5 hours presentation. If you're looking for articles, purchase information, and some other things, you are welcome to my website. And even shorter periodic updates and some photographs of items, they make it to my Facebook page. Again, thank you very much. It was a true pleasure, and I hope I didn't take all this time from you in a total way. Thank you.